My interest in Ned Kelly started when I was 10. An old gardener called Tom Main told me the Kelly story and lent me a book in which Ned was a straight-out hero, the police were the villains of the story. It was all wonderful stuff, and I completely believed it. So when I found another book about Ned Kelly a couple of months later, in which Ned was the villain and the police were the heroes, I was a bit surprised. Up to that stage, what I'd read in books was true. So I realized at the age of 10 that if I wanted to find out the truth about Ned Kelly, I'd really have to find it out for myself. So 54 years later, I published my biography of Ned Kelly, and I'm still learning. Picture Pond have produced this version of the Kelly story, which will introduce you to Ned Kelly. You may like to hunt further and find out more about him. If you do, I hope you'll have as much fun as I've had over the 60 years I've been looking for the truth of Ned Kelly and his story.
Ned Kelly was born in December 1854, the eldest son of Irish ex-convict John Red Kelly and Ellen Quinn, daughter of an Irish immigrant. The couple were married on the 18th of November 1850 at St Francis Roman Catholic Church, Melbourne. For the first few years of their marriage, they lived with Ellen's parents at Wallen. It was after they moved to a small farm in Beveridge, probably on the lower slopes of Mount Fraser, that Ellen gave birth to a baby boy. The couple named him Edward, but he would always be known as Ned. As Ned approached his 6th year, a Catholic school was built in Beveridge. At school, Ned was a likeable lad, and one of his fellow students, Fred Hopkins, remembered him as a tall and active youngster who excelled all other boys at school games. In 1864, Red and Ellen, now with 6 children, sold their land in Beveridge and moved north. In Avenel, Red rented 40 acres of grassland near Hughes Creek and established a dairy herd. Richard Shelton, a 7-year-old boy, was playing on the banks of Hughes Creek when he slipped and disappeared into the water. Ned witnessed this and saved the young boy from drowning. For his bravery, Ned received a beautiful green silk and gold bullion sash from the grateful Shelton family. Shortly after this, Ned's father died. Ellen Kelly, now with 7 children, settled on some land 3 miles out of Greta. 88 acres of bush, unfenced on poor soil. With the help of her brothers, she began developing the land at 11 Mile Creek. St Francis Church, where Red and Ellen were married, is still standing on the original site in Melbourne. It is dwarfed by the modern city, and is a reminder of how things have changed since the 1860s. The original Quinn homestead in Wallen is still standing. Situated on the Epping-Gilmore Road, the house has National Trust Heritage listing, and thanks to its current owners, is in surprisingly good condition for a wooden structure nearly 150 years old. The town of Beveridge, a small settlement on the outskirts of Melbourne, has a well-marked exit on the busy Hume Freeway. Kelly Street, running down to the southeastern corner of the town, takes you to the old house. Although in a sad state of disrepair, it's a tribute to Red's workmanship that it has survived this long. At the other end of town is the Catholic church, where Ned attended school. Benalla and District Historical Society Museum, the silk sash Ned received for saving Dick Shelton is on display. This fragile piece of cloth was one of Ned's most prized possessions. Hughes Creek today is a picturesque watercourse meandering through the gently rolling hills around Avenel. Another site worth a visit is the Avenel Cemetery, where Ned's father, John Red Kelly, is buried. Also buried here is Richard Shelton and his parents. The Kelly home site here at 11 Mile Creek is clearly visible from the road running between Greta and Benalla. The creek still flows through the property, and the bald hill behind the original selection known as Kelly's Lookout still stands guard over the land. Situated on private property, access is difficult to obtain. Sadly, all that marks the site today is a pair of lonely chimneys standing among the ruins of what should be one of Australia's best preserved historical sites. One of Ellen's visitors at 11 Mile Creek was Henry Johnson, alias Harry Parr, a middle-aged bushranger who had just escaped from Pentridge Jail. The chance to earn some money for his family and the thrill of playing the role of highway robber with Harry was obviously a temptation too strong for the young Ned to resist. It was during this time with him that Ned learnt the skills of bushranging, but most importantly the value of a broad sympathiser network that would prove so invaluable in the future. With the help of the Quins at Glenmore Station in the King River Valley, Harry set up a permanent camp on the western wall. Soon, reports that Harry had a young accomplice came flooding in. Harry was an old rogue with a fierce temper, and after one of his outbursts, Ned decided to leave him and head for home. He was only back at 11 Mile Creek for one night when the Benalla police raided the Kelly hut and arrested Ned on 2 charges of highway robbery. The charges would eventually be dropped. But while remanded in custody, Ned was thoroughly interrogated by Superintendents Hare and Nicholson, senior officers in the Victorian police force. Ned supplied them with some information, but he was certainly not the key informant. In fact, it was Ned's own uncle Jack Lloyd who collected the £500 reward for leading Superintendents Hare and Nicholson to a sleeping and very surprised Harry at his hideout above the King Valley. Parr's Lookout, as it is still known, is an impressive place with a commanding view of the entire King Valley. From the public lookout, it is obvious why this was a favourite spot for Harry. The main road, which was only a track in Harry's day, has changed its course very little since, and is still visible for miles in either direction. This poplar tree marks the Quinn property, and is clearly visible from the lookout. When observed from the valley floor, Parr's Lookout is barely noticeable, even with the large structure built there today. Ned's bad luck continued when Wild Wright lent him a horse, but neglected to mention it was stolen. Ned was caught riding the horse by Senior Constable Hall, which resulted in 3 years' hard labour. He was released on the 2nd of February 1874 and returned to the northeast. For 3 years he led the life of an honest man, working at a variety of jobs, including timber feller. He also tried his hand at building, utilising the skills of stonemasonry he'd learnt in prison. One Saturday, while Ned was having a drink at the Imperial Hotel in Beechworth, Wild Wright waltzed into the bar. There was a score to settle regarding the stolen horse incident and Ned's term in jail. A boxing match was organised on the flat beside the creek at the rear of the hotel. The fight would be London prize ring rules. After 20 rounds, which could have lasted 4 hours, Wild Wright conceded defeat, commenting years later that Ned gave him the hiding of his life. Beechworth today is a remarkably intact colonial town with many of the significant buildings of this era lovingly restored. It was here, on this river flat just behind the main street, that Ned and Wild had their famous bare-knuckle fight. This region has so much to offer the real Kelly enthusiast. The town's layout and streetscape are largely unchanged. The Burke Museum has a permanent Kelly exhibition. The courthouse has been restored and reopened to the public in 2001. These holding cells for the courthouse and below the council building are there for all to see and experience. The Hibernian and commercial hotels in the main street are where the gang would have often socialised. Finally, the house at Chesney Vale that Ned helped build in 1876 is privately owned. Its pink granite construction makes it easily recognisable even after 126 years. Ned decided to quit his job at the mill and go into business with his American stepfather, George King. Ned maintained that police persecution and harassment was the reason he gave up the life of an honest man, to start what was arguably the most successful horse-stealing operation in Australian history. This highly successful racket continued for many months, until a mysterious incident at the Kelly homestead on the 15th of April, 1878. Constable Fitzpatrick, a former friend of Ned and boyfriend of his sister Kate, tried to arrest Dan Kelly for horse-stealing. Fitzpatrick's version of the ill-fated visit claims that Ned shot him in the wrist, and he was hit on the head with a shovel by Mrs. Kelly. Ned would later claim that he was nowhere near the house at the time of the incident, but was also charged with attempted murder. Mrs. Kelly, with a baby at her breast, was put away for 3 years' hard labour. Ned and Dan offered to surrender themselves in return for their mother's release, but this offer was ignored. 2 weeks after the trial, 2 separate police parties were dispatched into the Wombat Ranges to capture the brothers, who were now accompanied by Joe Byrne and Steve Hart. It was the 26th of October, 1878, when Sergeant Kennedy, along with Constables Lonigan, Scanlon and McIntyre, made camp at Stringybark Creek, no more than a mile from the Kellys' hideout at Bullock Creek. The boys became aware of this and decided their only option was to try and disarm them. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when Constable McIntyre and Lonigan heard someone sing out, "Bail up and throw down your arms." The gang advanced, Ned and Dan with firearms, Joe and Steve unarmed. McIntyre obeyed, Lonigan did not. He dived behind a log and drew his revolver. Ned took aim, shot and killed him. McIntyre then told Ned Kennedy and Scanlon were out on patrol and expected back soon. When the 2 policemen returned, Ned and the others again called upon them to surrender their arms. Scanlon swung his gun around and blasted a shot at Ned. The returning fire hit its mark. The policeman slumped in his saddle and fell. Kennedy dismounted and began shooting from behind the horse. McIntyre seized the opportunity, jumped on Kennedy's horse and rode away, leaving Kennedy to fight it out. He retreated from tree to tree, exchanging shots with Ned until he was shot through the chest. Ned later explained he was sorry he shot Kennedy and would not have done so if he thought he would surrender. As the night closed in and storm clouds gathered, 3 police lay dead. Only Constable McIntyre had escaped. Soon the gang were officially declared outlaws, and a £2,000 reward offered for their capture, dead or alive. The site of the Stringybark Creek police murders is marked by what is commonly known as the Kelly tree. The road is clearly marked and the tree easy to find. A metal plate is embedded in the tree and will be completely overgrown in a few more years. Although in the approximate area the tree is not in the exact location of the shootings, repeated mining and timber milling over the last 120 years have changed the landscape and possibly the creek's course. This site has most of the characteristics associated with the battle: flattish ground with a slight slope to the west. This is the site of the hut at Bullock Creek, the gang's secret retreat. It's easy to see why Ned was concerned about the troopers camped at Stringybark. The two locations are indeed very close. With the help of friends and relatives, the gang remained at large until the 9th of December, when they re-emerged to stage some daring raids. With superbly executed bank robberies at Euroa, then Jerilderie, netting a total of £4,000, the gang's notoriety increased. The authorities responded by lifting the reward to £8,000, representing almost $2 million in modern-day currency. Sometime prior to the hold-up, a 56-page document known as the Jerilderie Letter was written by Ned and Joe, outlining the events at Stringybark and the outlaws' perspective on the situation in northeastern Victoria. In this letter we get a glimpse of Ned's vision for a republic and his role as a revolutionary rather than an outlaw. After Jerilderie, the gang disappeared for 16 months. Joe's friend, Aaron Sherritt, was able to capitalise on the situation by offering to help the police find the gang in return for his friend Joe's life being spared. Aaron's precarious role as double agent enabled him to convince Superintendent Hare and troopers to make camps in caves on the Woolshed Valley. At night they would move down the valley to keep watch on the Byrne homestead, where it was hoped Joe and Ned would eventually return. This farcical vigil added to the growing suspicion regarding Aaron's true motivation and alliances with the police. Meanwhile, the gang moved among loyal friends and family.
It was this huge band of loyal supporters that brought the Kelly outbreak to its climax. Police had tried locking them up for up to 3 months without trial or evidence, and it had simply backfired on them, swung even more people to support of the Kelly cause. Now, at the end of a series of disastrous seasons, in the middle of a bitter land war between small selector farmers and the big squatters, the police came up with an even more disastrous ploy. They provided the Lands Department with lists of names of Kelly friends and relatives, and no one on that list was allowed to take up land in the Kelly country. Farmers were being denied the right to make a living in the land they knew, among the people they knew, and this swung the Kelly outbreak into rebellion. Now came talk of a republic, the evergreen Irish dream, achieved in France and America, soon to be achieved in South Africa, dreamt of in Australia. The Republic of Northeastern Victoria, a fantastic plan that came extraordinarily close to success, but also was to bring about the destruction of the Kelly gang.
It was March 1880 when Benalla police, accompanied by Aboriginal black trackers, were dispatched to investigate the mysterious theft of plough mould boards from a number of selectors' properties. Ned had concocted what can only be described as a fantastic yet sadly fatal plan to construct 4 suits of body armour for a climactic battle with police. Each suit weighed between 90 and 100 pounds, making swift movement difficult and riding a horse virtually impossible. Police had been living at Aaron Sherritt's hut on surveillance for several weeks. On the night of Saturday, the 26th of June, 1880, there were 4 police hiding at the house. It is widely considered that Aaron's role was more in favour of protecting the gang and hoodwinking the police, yet he was finally and probably wrongly denounced as a traitor by the gang and their sympathisers. It was about 6 o'clock when he heard the voice from outside his hut. "It's Anton Wicks, and I've lost my way." Aaron opened the door to give directions. Joe Byrne, his close, lifelong friend, appeared out of the dark and shot him dead. The terrified police would not emerge to make an official report until midday Sunday. This contributed to the delayed arrival of a special police train lured to the district by Aaron's murder. It was the first crucial error of Ned's rebellion plan, which included the derailment of this train. The surviving police would then be overpowered by sympathisers gathered at Glenrowan. Today, if you venture a few kilometres out of Beechworth, there are a number of sites worth a visit. Few things have survived the tyranny of the years, but if you take time, you can still see Anton Wicks' fruit trees. Wicks was Aaron Sherritt's neighbour, and the person Joe Byrne used to lure Sherritt to his death. Still to be seen are the irises planted at the front of Aaron's hut. From the road leading into Woolshed Valley, you could look south to the surrounding hills and see where the police camped in caves with Sherritt to spy on Mrs. Byrne's house. These huge boulders that form the caves are unchanged, and the views to the valley are magnificent. Aaron knew this country well, and was able to convince Hare to camp here even though they could not see the Byrnes hut from this spot. Of all the situations Ned and the boys had been in, this was their defining moment, when their immortality was born. At Glenrowan they would launch themselves into the Australian psyche and become part of the fabric of Australian culture. It was some time after midnight, Saturday, June the 26th, when Ned and Steve arrived at Glenrowan. Their first attempts to sabotage the railway tracks were unsuccessful, so Ned called on Station Master Stainstreet, platelayers Sullivan, Reardon, and a group of navvies. By the time the task was finally completed, it was nearly dawn. Joe and Dan arrived at Jones Inn soon after. Here they would all await the arrival of the special police train, expected in the early hours of Sunday morning. Sunday saw a steady stream of people detained by the gang at Jones Inn and Stainstreet's home, where the women and children were held. By Sunday evening, there were a total of 62 prisoners. It had been 24 hours since Aaron's murder, and still no sign of the special train. The whole plan hinged on a surprise first strike. As Sunday rolled on, with still no sign of the train, the plan should have been abandoned. On Sunday night, Ned made the decision to release 21 prisoners he felt he could trust. It was late Sunday night when schoolmaster Curnow, after winning Ned's trust, was allowed to go home with his wife and children. However, Curnow's true agenda was to foil the gang's derailment plans. It was 2:30 Monday morning when he scampered through the bush, armed with a red scarf and candle. The driver of the pilot train saw the crude signal and brought the locomotive to a halt. Curnow warned the police on board the tracks ahead had been broken. From here, the train proceeded cautiously towards Glenrowan. It was Joe who first heard the train approaching. Ned ordered the lights to be doused. With the troopers advancing, the gang, now in their armour, took up positions along the front of the inn. In the bright moonlight they could plainly see the figure of Hare running towards the inn armed with a shotgun. Ned took aim and fired, sending a bullet crashing into Hare's wrist. The The rest of the gang then opened fire, sending startled police ducking for cover. Despite his armour, Ned was hit in the left arm and right foot. In the first minute, about 60 police bullets penetrated the flimsy inn, mortally wounding 3 civilians, including 13-year-old Jack Jones. Ned had given orders to fire 2 signal rockets to mobilise the small army of sympathisers once the train had been derailed. In the confusion, the unfortunate decision was made to launch the rockets anyway. Ned would now have to warn the sympathisers not to attack the heavily armed police. Ned, badly injured, made his way to his mare concealed at the back of the inn and rode to the sympathisers' meeting place. He had decided his loyal supporters must take no further part in the bungled plan. It was about 4:30 a.m. when Ned returned to the hotel in an attempt to rescue his mates. As he entered the inn, a volley of police fire cut through the building, mortally wounding Joe. With his best friend dead, Ned decided to leave the inn, thinking that Dan and Steve were following. But when he met Tom Lloyd, he realised they must still be inside. By now, Ned had been bleeding heavily for nearly 3 hours and was fading in and out of consciousness. Yet he would make one final attempt to save his brother and friend. The sun had begun to rise when police noticed something huge and strange moving through the bush. Ned called out to the boys, "Come out and we'll whip the buggers." Dan and Steve appeared at the back door and opened fire, while the police continued their unrelenting barrage on Ned. Staggering forward, he found cover by a huge fallen tree. 15 yards away, Sergeant Steele took aim and fired a charge of buckshot at Ned's unprotected legs, hitting him in the right knee. A second blast from Steele's weapon sent the ironclad outlaw crashing to the ground. After a struggle, they removed his helmet and realized it was Ned himself. Steele would have executed him then and there, but was stopped by Constable Bracken, one of Ned's prisoners from the previous night. Ned was taken to the railway station, where he was treated for wounds to his arms, legs, feet, hands and groin. More than 28 wounds in all. At 10 a.m. a ceasefire was called and the remaining civilians were released. At around 3 p.m. Sadler gave permission to set fire to the inn. By now there was close to 1,000 spectators gathered. Father Gibney rushed into the burning hotel, followed by 2 policemen who emerged with Joe Burns' body. Gibney informed police that Dan and Steve were dead. Their charred remains would not be retrieved until the burning hotel was completely destroyed. With the crowd gathering around their remains and growing more hostile by the moment, Sadler was forced to make the unlikely but prudent decision to surrender the bodies to the gathered sympathisers, led by Maggie Skillion, Kate Kelly, Dick Hart and Wild Wright. Today the scene is pretty well mapped out for the thousands of tourists that flock to Glenrowan each year. The town is unashamedly the tourist headquarters of Kelly country. These site maps are a reasonable guide to one of Australia's most famous historical locations, Ned Kelly's Last Stand. From the railway bridge, you can easily see the immediate layout of the siege area, the battle site lying between the station and hotel. The trench where the police took cover during the first volley is marked by these pole men. It was here that Superintendent Hare was wounded. In Church Street there is a plaque that commemorates the position where Ned supposedly fell. Further investigation has revealed that this small stump is closer to the actual site. Either way, it does not detract from the significance of the siege area. The station itself has been restored to its original state. It is not hard to imagine a badly wounded Ned being treated at this exact spot. News of the tragedy soon spread throughout the colony and beyond. Ned was taken by train along with the body of Joe Byrne to the Benalla lockup amid fears of a rescue attempt by sympathisers. The following day, Joe Byrne's body was hung on a door to be photographed. To many, this macabre and rather sick spectacle remains one of the most startling illustrations of the authorities' desperate yet vain attempts to undermine the courage of these four young men, whose exploits have endured as some of the most poignant and memorable in Australian history. Upon his arrival in Melbourne, Ned slowly recovered strength in the jail hospital. Despite repeated written and verbal requests, he was refused permission to see relatives to arrange his defence. After 5 weeks, Ned was transported to Beechworth for the police court committal hearing for the murder of police at Stringybark Creek. The trial was then transferred to the Supreme Court in Melbourne, commencing on the 28th of October, 1880. The judge was Sir Redmond Barry, the same Judge Barry who had sentenced Ned's mother to 3 years' hard labour only 2 weeks before the shootings at Stringybark. Ned's barrister, Henry Massey Bindon, was a young and inexperienced lawyer. The trial lasted 2 days, during which the Crown's prime witness, the survivor of the Stringybark shootings, Constable McIntyre, gave perjurious accounts of the murder of Lonergan at Stringybark Creek. Finally, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty as charged. Ned, commenting during a remarkable dialogue with Barry, "I dare say, but a day will come at a bigger court than this, when we will see which is right and which is wrong." Redmond Barry then sentenced the prisoner to death in the usual form, ending with the words, "May the Lord have mercy on your soul." Ned replied, "I will go a little further than that and say, I will see you there where I go." The old Melbourne Jail in Melbourne CBD is one of Victoria's most popular tourist attractions, with almost 150,000 visitors per annum. The jail is a stark reminder of the harshness of the 19th century penal system. The condemned cell where Ned spent his last hour is open for inspection. Also on display is a suit of armour, a revolver, and one of Ned's death masks. At the end of the long row of cells is the hangman's workplace. A trapdoor, noose, and release lever, all chilling examples of a more brutal past, when a young man called Ned Kelly uttered those famous words, "Such is life."
Ned Kelly was executed at 10 a.m. on the 11th of November 1880. His body was left to hang for half an hour, then it was taken down and wheeled across to the Melbourne Jail Dead House, where a group of doctors and students hacked it to pieces and removed virtually every organ. What was left was placed in a red gum coffin the following day and buried in an unmarked grave in the jail grounds. And that should have been the end of the story. But of course it was really only the beginning. Ned Kelly and the legend which grew around him had become immortal.